Snow was falling again over Boston, soft, weightless, like a secret the city refused to tell. Inside Le Verre d'Or, the light was honey gold, spilling over linen and silver, as if to convince its guests that winter couldn't reach them here. To the wealthy patrons who came to dine, it was a sanctuary of power, where a reservation meant recognition, and recognition meant everything. But for Claire Moreau, 22, it was only a second shift in a very long day. She moved through the restaurant like a quiet melody, quick, precise, invisible. Her crisp white shirt still carried the faint scent of the library she'd left just an hour ago. While other students at Harvard finished their term papers and drank coffee by the Charles River, Claire was memorizing orders, balancing trays, and calculating how many more nights like this would pay next semester's tuition. A couple at table 6 laughed, an expensive rehearsed sound. When Claire leaned in to recite the menu's French names, the man waved a dismissive hand. "Say it in English," he said, chuckling to his date. "Your accent's too Paris for Boston." Claire froze for half a heartbeat. She wasn't Parisian. She had never even been to France. But her mother, an art teacher from Lyon, had taught her the language of beauty and precision before she could walk. That accent wasn't pretension. It was inheritance. Still, she smiled the polite smile she'd practiced in the mirror. "Of course, sir. The pan-seared duck it is." As she walked back to the kitchen, her manager, Mr. Coleman, intercepted her like a storm in a suit. "Claire," he hissed, low enough to sound professional, sharp enough to cut. "Try not to correct the guests. Just be agreeable. You're not teaching French here." He didn't wait for her answer. He never did. To Coleman, a perfect employee wasn't smart or efficient. It was obedient. Claire exhaled, staring at her reflection in the brass wall panel. The same tired eyes, the same neat bun, the same forced calm. Behind her, the kitchen roared with clattering pans and shouted orders in a half-dozen languages. English, Spanish, Italian, Mandarin. It was chaotic, beautiful in its own way. Each voice was a puzzle piece of survival. She set her tray down and whispered to herself in French, almost as prayer. Les mots sont des ponts. Words are bridges. That was what she believed. That language could connect people who otherwise would never understand each other. But in this world of tips and tempers, bridges didn't matter. Only transactions did. From the other end of the prep counter, Rosa, her fellow waitress, called out with a grin. "Hey, polyglot, what are you mumbling about this time?" Claire smiled faintly. "Just keeping my vocabulary alive." Rosa wiped her hands on her apron, shaking her head. "You speak, what, 4 languages now? English, French, Italian, and whatever that whispering thing is when you're mad?" Claire laughed softly. "That's not a language, that's exhaustion." Rosa leaned closer, lowering her voice. "You know, if I could talk like you, I'd work for the United Nations or something, not this place." Claire shrugged. "The United Nations probably has waitresses too. They just call them assistants." They both laughed, but underneath the humor, there was truth. In the gleaming theater of Le Verre d'Or, everyone performed. The guests with their charm, the staff with their deference. Only the chandeliers told the truth, hanging overhead like crystal witnesses to 1,000 small humiliations. At 9:30, the dinner rush began. The doors opened to coats lined with fur, voices lined with arrogance. Claire adjusted her apron, tying it tighter. Armor for another battle. Her fingers brushed against a folded scrap of paper in her pocket, her linguistics notes. She kept them there like a secret weapon. Phonetics, semantics, pragmatics. Concepts that made her heart race more than any compliment from a guest ever could. In her mind, she translated everything she heard, English to French, French to Italian, tone to truth. The way a man said "thank you" could reveal more about him than the tip he left. She passed table 3, an old professor lecturing his date about investments, and caught the phrase, "People in service just don't think big." She wanted to tell him she was writing her thesis on language as power hierarchy. She wanted to tell him that service, in its truest sense, was an art form. Instead, she refilled his wine glass and said nothing. Rosa brushed past her, whispering, "Smile, or Coleman's gonna bite your head off again." Claire smirked. "Then he should start with my student loans." They both stifled a laugh. For a moment, the heaviness lifted. Outside, the snow thickened. Through the frosted window, Boston's skyline glowed like a constellation. Every office window, a tiny universe of ambition. Claire imagined herself out there, not serving at someone else's table, but sitting at her own, speaking in rooms where her words mattered, but dreams had bills, and bills had deadlines. She carried a tray of champagne flutes toward the private section. The air there was different, colder, quieter, expensive. On the far wall, a polished plaque read, Le Verre d'Or, Est, 1928. Underneath it, a single empty table waited, its silver gleaming brighter than the rest. Mr. Coleman's voice cut through the room. Claire, table 7's reserved. Be on your best behavior. VIP clients from Europe tonight. Don't mess this up. Who are they? She asked. He glanced at the reservation card, nervous and proud all at once. Dubreuil? Lucien Dubreuil? The name stirred something in her memory. Ink, not gossip. A chapter from her sociolinguistics course. A quote she'd underlined twice. Language reveals the truth, power hides. El Dubreuil. She felt a chill unrelated to the winter outside. Rosa caught her eye and mouthed, Who's that? Claire whispered, Someone who believes words are weapons. Coleman didn't notice. He was too busy rehearsing his smile in the mirrored wall. Remember, he warned, wealthy Europeans expect perfection. Speak when spoken to. Don't show off. Claire's reply was automatic. Yes, sir. But in her chest, something rebelled. A flicker of quiet defiance she couldn't quite explain. Perhaps it was the fatigue. Perhaps it was the way the couple earlier had laughed at her accent. Or perhaps it was destiny sharpening its pen, preparing to write. The first line of a story that would change her life. She carried the tray to the service station, where the silver caught the reflection of her face. For a second, she saw two versions of herself. One, the obedient waitress the world expected. The other, the scholar who understood that every language carries its own kind of power. Rosa nudged her shoulder. You okay, Professor? Claire smiled faintly. Just thinking. About what? About how sometimes, she said softly, the people who listen quietly are the ones who understand everything. Rosa blinked, then grinned. Deep. You sure you're not writing a book? Maybe someday, Claire replied. But tonight, I just serve the wine. The clock struck 10. The doors opened again, letting in a gust of icy air and a presence that made the chandeliers seem to dim. The maitre d' straightened, whispering something to Coleman, and Claire, adjusting the tray in her hands, didn't yet know that the man stepping through the golden doorway was about to test not just her patience, but everything she believed about language, dignity, and the power to speak. By 10:30, Le Verre d'Or was a symphony of nervous precision. The chandeliers shimmered brighter than usual, as if they too sensed that something extraordinary, or dangerous, was about to enter the room. Rumors travel faster than footsteps in places built on hierarchy, and tonight, the whisper spread like fire through velvet curtains and marble floors. Lucien Dubreuil is coming. The name moved through the restaurant in cautious tones, like an incantation. Even the kitchen staff, people too busy to care about Wall Street or Paris, paused for a heartbeat when they heard it. Lucien Dubreuil, the French billionaire, the man who once turned a bankrupt firm into Europe's most profitable investment empire, half philosopher, half predator. In the office, Mr. Coleman adjusted his tie 3 times and still looked pale. He gathered the staff in a tight line beside the service station, his voice quivering with both excitement and fear. All right, everyone, listen up. We have a VIP dining tonight, Lucien Dubreuil himself. The name alone seemed to lower the temperature of the room. Coleman's eyes darted from face to face like a general before battle. He's here in Boston finalizing a major acquisition deal with U.S. funds. This isn't dinner, it's diplomacy. So no mistakes, no improvising, no heroics. Got it? A few nodded silently. Someone dropped a spoon. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Coleman snapped his fingers. Pick it up, quietly. He began pacing in front of them, explaining how to fold napkins the Parisian way, though none of them, including him, actually knew what that meant. He gestured wildly at the servers. I want synchronized service, smooth, elegant, continental. Rosa whispered to Claire under her breath. What does continental even mean? Claire replied softly. It means we're all supposed to pretend we're from somewhere else. Coleman caught the tail end of the whisper. "Quiet," he barked. Then, softening for a moment, he turned to Claire. "Actually, Moreau, you might be useful tonight. You speak French, right?" "Yes, sir," Claire answered cautiously. "Good," Coleman said, straightening his vest. "Then you'll be at table 7. The room stilled. Table 7 wasn't just another table. It was the stage where legends were made or destroyed. Even the sous chef looked up from his station. "She's new," he muttered. Coleman raised a hand. "She's the only one who can pronounce his name without offending him. That's all that matters tonight." Rosa blinked. "You sure that's not too much pressure for one person?" Coleman ignored her. He moved closer to Claire, lowering his voice into a hiss meant to sound encouraging, but came out like a threat. "This is your big chance, Moreau. Impress him, and you might finally get noticed around here. But if you slip, if you so much as breathe the wrong way, you'll be looking for work, somewhere else by morning." He smiled tightly, the kind of smile that hides panic. "Understood?" Claire nodded once, her heart beat loud in her ears. In truth, the name Lucien Dubreuil wasn't foreign to her. She remembered it from her sophomore year at Harvard, printed across the spine of a dense book she could barely afford, but refused to return to the library. It had been titled Language and Power, The Semiotics of Control. Dubreuil had once been a philosopher before turning to finance, a man who believed that every negotiation, every sentence, every silence was a transaction of dominance. He wrote, "Words do not simply describe the world, they design it." To read him was to be fascinated and unsettled at once. And now, somehow, that same man was about to sit 10 feet away from her, expecting perfect service and invisible obedience. The irony made her smile faintly, though she quickly hid it. Coleman's voice snapped her back to the present. Uniform check. Shoes polished, ties straight, no perfume too strong. Dubreuil hates distractions. He turned toward the maitre d'. "Did you confirm his arrival time?" 11 sharp, came the reply. "Party of 3. Mr. Dubreuil, his assistant Evelyn Hart, and one British investor, Thomas Gray." Coleman clapped his hands nervously. "All right then. Everyone take your stations. I want no confusion when they arrive. Claire, you're the face of table 7. Don't speak unless spoken to. And if you are spoken to, think before you breathe." Claire wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Think before breathing? That was the motto of fear. But she just said, "Yes, sir," and turned toward the service area. The kitchen was chaos in motion. Orders shouted in Spanish, the hiss of butter meeting steel, the smell of thyme and truffle filling the air. Someone taped a red paper above the order board that read, "Table 7, Dubreuil Group." Every cook who glanced at it straightened their posture a little. Rosa leaned over the counter and whispered, "If you survive tonight, you'll be a legend." Claire smirked, trying to hide her nerves. "Or unemployed." Rosa laughed, handing her a tray of polished glassware. "You'll be fine. Just don't let them smell fear or ambition. Rich people can sniff both." That made Claire laugh quietly, but inside, her mind was already spinning. What did one even say, or not say, to a man like Lucien Dubreuil? She imagined him as the books had described, brilliant, intimidating, fluent in 5 languages, allergic to incompetence, a man who saw people as chess pieces, useful until they weren't. And yet, part of her admired him. To rise from philosophy to finance, from words to worlds, that took genius. She just hoped tonight wouldn't prove that geniuses could also be monsters. Coleman reappeared, his face slick with tension. "All right, Claire, final check." He examined her uniform, adjusted the knot of her tie, and lowered his voice. "Remember, eye contact only when necessary. And for heaven's sake, don't try to bond with him. He doesn't bond, he conquers." Claire met his gaze calmly. "I'll serve, not surrender." Coleman blinked, half confused by her phrasing, then waved her off. "Whatever that means, just don't make him angry." She turned toward the dining room. The murmur of conversation had softened, replaced by a subtle, anticipatory hush. The guests at other tables were aware, even if they pretended not to be. Wealth recognizes wealth. It also trembles before greater versions of itself. Claire adjusted her posture, placing the polished menus in her left hand, the linen over her right arm. Through the glass doors, she could already see the reflection of headlights pulling up outside, the limousine stretching across the curb like a black serpent. Inside, Rosa caught her eye and mouthed, "Good luck." Claire gave a faint nod, her lips pressing into a quiet prayer she didn't fully believe. The door swung open. The maître d' straightened his jacket, his voice an octave higher. "Monsieur Dubreuil, bienvenue à la Verre d'Or." And there he was. Lucien Dubreuil stepped into the golden light as though the room itself bowed to him, tall, silver-haired, impeccably dressed in charcoal gray. His face was unreadable, a sculpture of intellect and control. Behind him, Evelyn Hart followed like a shadow, sharp suit, sharper eyes. Thomas Gray trailed behind, eager and nervous, the scent of ambition trailing with him. The world seemed to hold its breath. Mr. Coleman rushed forward, his handshake trembling. "Mr. Dubreuil, sir, an absolute honor. We've reserved our finest table." Lucien's gaze swept across the room once, brief but devastating. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. His presence was gravity itself. "Table 7, he said simply, his accent smooth and clipped. "Yes, sir, right this way." Claire's pulse thudded as she stepped forward, menus in hand. She could feel the collective tension of every employee behind her. As Lucien approached, his eyes flicked toward her name tag. Claire Moreau. For a split second, something unreadable passed through his expression. Recognition, perhaps, or irony. Then it vanished. "Bonsoir," she said softly. "Welcome to Le Verre d'Or." Lucien's reply came in flawless French. "Do you always greet your guests in the language of their impatience, Mademoiselle Moreau?" She met his gaze without flinching. "Only when they understand it." For the first time, a corner of his mouth curved, half a smirk, half a test. Mr. Coleman froze behind them, not daring to breathe. The game, though no one knew it yet, had just begun. The clock on the far wall struck 7, though time itself seemed to pause the moment Lucien Dubreuil crossed the threshold. He didn't enter the dining room, he took possession of it. Every gesture, every silent pause carried the weight of entitlement, as if the very air adjusted its temperature to his presence. He wore black, not the glossy black of vanity, but the deep, matte kind, the shade of authority that absorbs light instead of reflecting it. His silver hair was brushed back, his stride measured, unhurried. Behind him, Evelyn Hart followed with the precision of a second hand circling a clock, quiet, constant, inevitable. And Thomas Gray, the British investor, kept pace 2 steps behind, his grin wide but his eyes darting, like a man walking beside a storm and pretending it's a breeze. At table 7, Lucien paused. He didn't look around to appreciate the chandeliers, or the imported marble, or even the nervous staff. He simply touched the back of the chair with a gloved hand and gave a slight nod, an unspoken command for Evelyn to prepare it. She moved instantly, setting down his coat and adjusting the silverware to perfect alignment. "Merci," he murmured, not gratitude, just acknowledgement. When he finally sat, the atmosphere shifted again. The clinking of glasses and low murmurs elsewhere softened, drawn into the gravity of his composure. Even those who didn't recognize him could feel it, the invisible hierarchy that followed men like him. Mr. Coleman hovered nearby, wringing his hands like a host at a royal banquet. But Lucien didn't glance at him once. He had already categorized Coleman, non-essential background noise. Evelyn took her seat to his right, Thomas to his left. She opened a black leather folio, and he removed a single fountain pen, custom, gold-trimmed, absurdly elegant. They spoke in alternating rhythms of French and English, their words sharp as crystal. "Le Fonds américain attendra jusqu'à demain," Evelyn said quietly. "The American fund will wait until tomorrow." "Ils n'ont pas le choix," Lucien replied without looking up. "They have no choice." Thomas, eager to participate, leaned forward. "I'd rather not keep them waiting too long, sir. They can be impatient when money's involved." Lucien's gaze lifted just once. "And that, Mr. Gray, is why they will lose." Thomas faltered, then nodded quickly, forcing a laugh. "Of course. Quite right." Lucien turned his attention back to the documents before him, the corner of his mouth twitching in silent amusement. Power, for him, wasn't spoken. It was implied. Across the room, Claire steadied a tray of crystal glasses, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. She had served hundreds of guests before, diplomats, doctors, even a senator once. But none of them felt like this. It wasn't fear that made her hand tremble slightly. It was awareness. The kind that comes when you recognize you're standing in the orbit of someone who thrives on control. She approached the table quietly, her steps soft on the carpet, her reflection flickering across the silver dome covers and polished glasses. When she reached table 7, she paused, waiting for the conversation to pause too. It didn't. "Good evening," she said in English, her tone calm and professional. "Would you care for a selection from our wine list?" Lucian didn't answer right away. His pen froze midair. Then, slowly, he looked up. For a man so composed, his gaze was unnervingly direct, cold gray eyes that seemed to strip away every layer between what one was and what one pretended to be. It wasn't flirtation nor cruelty. It was study. A scientist dissecting a subject with nothing but silence. Claire held his gaze for exactly 1 second, long enough to be polite, not long enough to be mistaken for boldness. Her heart thudded against her ribs. He blinked once, then spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "French wine, naturally," he said, "though I imagine you already know which one to recommend." His accent carried a soft Parisian lilt, elegant and dangerous at once. Claire nodded, her tone perfectly even. For a meal this late, perhaps the Chateau Margaux 2005. Full-bodied, balanced, strong character, gentle finish. The faintest trace of approval crossed his expression. A rare vintage. She met his eyes again, this time just long enough to add, rare, but worth serving correctly. The tension between them was like static. Evelyn's eyes flicked up from her folio, studying Claire for the first time. "She understands French, doesn't she?" Evelyn murmured in the language softly. Lucian's lips twitched. "Elle comprend plus que ça." "She understands more than that." Thomas laughed nervously. "Ah, bilingual staff. Very efficient." Lucian ignored him. His gaze hadn't left Claire. "She looks intelligent," he said in French, still low enough that only Evelyn could hear. "Too intelligent for her job. That's dangerous." Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "For her or for you?" Lucian didn't answer. He simply leaned back, the candlelight catching the silver streak in his hair, the faint reflection of the flame flickering in his pupils. His expression remained unreadable. Part intrigue, part warning. Claire, oblivious to their quiet exchange, poured the wine carefully. The deep red liquid slid into the glasses with a soft whisper. She caught her own reflection in the surface, her eyes steady, her face calm, but her pulse betrayed her. When she turned to leave, Lucian's voice stopped her. "Tell me, Mademoiselle Moreau," he said in English, "how does a young woman with a French surname end up serving wine in Boston?" She hesitated, the question sharper than it appeared. The same way a philosopher ends up running hedge funds, perhaps. For the first time that night, Lucian smiled, small, almost imperceptible, but real. Evelyn looked startled. Thomas stared between them, lost. "That," Lucian said softly, "was an answer worth listening to." Claire inclined her head. "Then I'm glad I spoke." She walked away before he could reply. As she disappeared toward the service corridor, Evelyn leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're interested." Lucian's eyes followed the faint reflection of her silhouette on the mirrored wall. "I'm observant." Evelyn smirked faintly. "And what did you observe?" "That intellect," he said, his tone almost reflective. "It hides behind obedience, but intellect always leaks through the cracks." Thomas chuckled, eager to lighten the moment. "Sounds like trouble." Lucian swirled the wine in his glass, his gaze distant. "Trouble," he said, "is another word for opportunity." From across the room, Claire caught a glimpse of him in the mirrored column, the faint smile, the way he raised his glass slightly before taking a slow sip. It wasn't a toast, it was a declaration, an unspoken message she didn't yet understand. The rest of the night moved in rhythm, orders placed, plates served, polite conversation masking unspoken calculations. But for Claire, the air felt heavier, charged with something unseen. Each time she passed by table 7, she could feel his eyes on her, not invasive, not lecherous, but analytical, like he was searching for a pattern in her silence. By 11, when the crowd began to thin, Rosa whispered, "You all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Claire smiled faintly. "Not a ghost," she said quietly. "A man who doesn't blink." Rosa frowned. "Creepy?" Not exactly. Claire paused, glancing toward the table where Lucien still sat, unreadable as ever. Just dangerous in a different way. The chandeliers dimmed slightly as the night deepened. At table 7, the candlelight flickered, reflecting off the wine glasses. In one of them, if you looked closely, you could see both their faces, his calm, hers uncertain, mirrored together in the curved surface of the same glass. Two worlds already colliding, neither aware that the impact had just begun. The dinner had settled into its rhythm, the sound of silver against porcelain, the muted hum of wealth disguised as civility. But beneath the surface, a different kind of conversation was about to begin, one without menus or manners, one fought entirely with words. Lucien Dubreuil leaned back in his chair, his fingers resting lightly on the stem of his wine glass. He had watched Claire move between tables for the past half hour, silent, efficient, unflustered. There was a poise to her that didn't fit the uniform. "Mademoiselle Moreau," he called softly, his tone polite but edged with something sharper. The syllables of her name rolled off his tongue like a test he already expected her to fail. Claire turned, tray in hand, calm as ever. "Yes, sir." He gestured toward the bottle she had opened earlier. "Tell me," he said, now switching smoothly into French, "Que savez-vous du Bordeaux 2007? What do you know of Bordeaux 2007? The question was casual on the surface, but it was a trap. It wasn't really about wine. It was about composure, whether she would shrink under pressure or rise above it. Claire placed the tray down and folded her hands neatly. Her answer came in the same language, fluent and measured. L'année 2007 a été chaude et sèche au début, mais la pluie de septembre a équilibré le fruit. Les vins sont pleins, structurés, élégants, sans excès. The year 2007 began hot and dry, but September's rain restored balance. The wines are full-bodied, structured, and elegant without excess. Her pronunciation was flawless. Not the theatrical French that Americans mimicked, but the kind that lived in the bones of someone who understood rhythm as much as grammar. Thomas Gray's eyebrows rose. "Impressive," he murmured. Lucien tilted his head slightly, watching her the way a chess player studies a surprising move. "Vous connaissez bien votre sujet," he said. "You know your subject well." "Je connais ce que j'aime," she replied lightly. "I know what I love." That earned a ghost of a smile from him, but only for a second. He wasn't finished. He set his glass down and began again, his French older this time, richer, archaic, almost poetic. "Les mots sont des instruments de pouvoir, non de la vérité," he said, his eyes fixed on hers. "Words are instruments of power, not of truth. Do you agree?" Evelyn's head turned slightly. The tone wasn't that of a diner speaking to a waitress. It was a scholar testing a student. Claire paused. He was quoting himself. Language and Power, page 42. She had underlined it 3 years ago. Her answer came softly, in the same language. Pascal wrote that eloquence is a mirror of the soul. When the glass is clean, truth passes through. When it is clouded by pride, it only reflects the speaker. Thomas blinked. "Was that philosophy?" "Pascal," Lucien replied, his voice quieter now. "Et correctement. Cité." And correctly quoted. A silence followed, a charged, almost reverent stillness, broken only by the low hum of the jazz trio in the corner. For the briefest of moments, his expression shifted, something almost like surprise. He hadn't expected her to answer, much less to counter. "Vous lisez Pascal?" he asked, still in French. "You read Pascal?" "Among others," she said. "I study languages, not just to translate words, but to understand how people use them to build or destroy one another." That struck him harder than he expected. It was the same argument he had made in a lecture hall in Paris 15 years ago, the one that had launched his book, his career, his legend. Evelyn caught the tension and intervened with a soft laugh. "You found a kindred spirit, Monsieur Dubreuil." Lucien didn't respond. He was still studying Claire, his mind turning over the anomaly before him. It was rare for anyone to meet his intellect head-on, rarer still for it to come from behind a linen apron. Finally, he said, "You're not a linguist working here for fun, I assume?" Claire smiled faintly. "Fun doesn't pay tuition." Thomas chuckled, sipping his wine. "She's got wit, sir. That's something." But Lucien wasn't smiling anymore. His voice dropped back into French, colder this time. La curiosité, mademoiselle, est une arme à double tranchant. Trop de savoir attire le feu. Curiosity, mademoiselle, is a double-edged sword. Too much knowledge draws fire. Her tone didn't waver. And yet, it's the only fire worth standing near. Evelyn's fork froze halfway to her lips. Lucian's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but calculation. It had been a long time since anyone dared finish a thought he'd started. There was something about her, an absence of fear that intrigued him, but also unsettled him. He leaned back, letting the candlelight carve the edges of his face. Tread carefully, Mademoiselle Moreau. Some fires burn brighter than they forgive. Claire inclined her head slightly, accepting the warning without conceding the point. Then, I suppose I'll serve carefully too. Evelyn gave a quiet chuckle, tension dissolving just enough for the air to move again. Thomas raised his glass. Well, this is the most intellectual dinner I've had in years. Lucian ignored him. His gaze stayed on Claire, watching as she lifted the empty bottle to replace it with another. There was no tremor in her hands now. Only precision, the same precision he demanded from the world. As she poured, he said quietly, Vous êtes très jeune pour répondre comme ça. You're very young to answer like that. Claire's reply was instant. You're not too old to ask like that. A small laugh escaped him then, not mocking, not cold, but genuine surprise. He turned slightly toward Evelyn. You hear that? She's quoting back my age as a moral lesson. Evelyn smirked. You might have met your match. Lucian's smile faded as quickly as it appeared. He tapped the rim of his glass once, the sound sharp, final. Trop de confiance peut être une faiblesse. Confidence can be a weakness. Claire replaced the bottle on the tray, her voice soft but unwavering. Only when it hides fear. I don't hide, monsieur. Something shifted in him then. He didn't like being challenged, but he respected precision, especially when delivered without arrogance. He inclined his head slightly. Then, perhaps, you'll survive this industry longer than most. Or burn faster, she said. Perhaps, he replied, and finally raised his glass. To the brave, then. She met his gaze, her chin lifting just a fraction. To the honest. The glasses clinked softly, a quiet, accidental toast between adversaries. Evelyn exhaled slowly, glancing at Thomas, who looked both entertained and alarmed. The philosopher and Lucian had found a mirror, and he wasn't sure if he liked his reflection. Claire stepped back, gathering her tray. Her heart was racing, but her face remained calm. As she turned away, she caught a glimpse of his eyes in the reflection of the wine bottle, still watching, calculating, searching. Whatever this was, a test, a game, or a warning, it wasn't over. It had only just begun. It began with a whisper, not a sound, the soundless whoosh of wine meeting air, the glint of red liquid turning into silk as it slid from the bottle's neck. Claire had poured 1,000 glasses before. It was a ritual she could perform blindfolded. One fluid movement, one perfect arc. But perfection, like dignity, is a fragile thing. It needs only a heartbeat to fracture. The candlelight shimmered through the crimson wine, catching a reflection, Lucian's face, still and watching. He didn't look at the bottle, he looked at her hands. And in that single second of attention, destiny slipped. A single drop escaped, small, weightless, but unforgiving. It struck the edge of Lucian's cuff like a wound blooming in slow motion, red on white, elegance defiled. The world seemed to freeze. The music faltered mid-note, as if the pianist had felt it too. The dining room's low chatter dulled into silence, replaced by the quiet dread of something breaking. Even the chandeliers seemed to dim, their light trembling over the tablecloth. Evelyn's eyes widened. "Oh no," she whispered under her breath. Thomas stopped chewing. His fork hovered mid-air. From across the room, Mr. Coleman, watching like a hawk, went pale. His lips formed silent horror. No, no, no. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She began softly, reaching for a napkin. But Lucian raised a hand. Not a word, just that one gesture. The command was enough to stop her mid-motion. He stared at the small crimson mark spreading across his cuff. His expression didn't change. No anger, no outrage, just stillness. The kind that's far more dangerous. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, almost casually, he spoke in French. Toujours la maladresse des petites gens. It was quiet, almost tender, and yet every syllable carried the elegance of cruelty. Always the clumsiness of the small people. Evelyn exhaled through her nose, a subtle nod of agreement. Thomas gave an awkward chuckle, eager to align himself with power. Yes, yes, he said in English. Happens all the time, doesn't it? Staff in these places, so nervous around big names. Lucien didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence was affirmation. The words hung there, invisible to most, but not to Claire. Every letter landed like a stone in her chest. She had read enough of his essays to know that tone, half sociological, half contemptuous. The intellectual's version of disdain. Her heart pounded in her ears. The air around her grew dense. To the others, it was just French, beautiful, unknowable. To her, it was anatomy. The exact phrasing of insult. La maladresse des petites gens. Not people, small people. She could have pretended not to understand. She could have smiled, murmured another apology, and moved on. But the sound of his words sliced too cleanly. This wasn't about a drop of wine. It was about class, about power, about the quiet assumption that some people are meant to serve and others to command. Lucien turned slightly toward Thomas and Evelyn, still speaking in French. Ils veulent toujours paraître utiles, ces enfants de la servitude, he said. They always wish to appear useful, these children of servitude. Evelyn's lips curved faintly, not quite smiling. Thomas gave another uneasy laugh, glancing around as though to see if anyone had heard. They believed the language was armor, that the melody of French made cruelty sound poetic. Claire stood frozen, her face neutral, her hands steady. But inside her, a storm gathered, the kind that brews not in thunder, but in restraint. Her eyes drifted briefly to the spill. It wasn't even a stain anymore, just a faint blush on his cuff. Yet to Lucien, it was enough evidence to judge an entire class of people. She remembered her mother's voice years ago, when she was still a child learning her first foreign word. Les mots ont du poids, ma chérie. Words carry weight. Her mother had taught her that to master a language was to wield power responsibly. But tonight, she was learning the opposite. That power used carelessly could turn language into a weapon. Lucien continued his quiet commentary, unaware or uncaring, that his target understood every syllable. Elle croit qu'un peu de grâce efface la médiocrité, he said lightly. She thinks a little grace can erase mediocrity. Thomas laughed louder this time, not out of humor, but habit. Yes, quite right, Lucien. Well said. Even Evelyn's voice softened into approval. C'est joliment dit, beautifully put. Claire's fingers tightened around the bottle's neck. The metal tray beneath her arm felt suddenly heavier, as if the weight of all their arrogance had settled there. Her reflection quivered in the glass, two versions of herself flickering back and forth, the server and the scholar, the silent and the seen. The insult echoed in her head, perfectly conjugated, perfectly cruel. Her breathing steadied, her pulse slowed. She placed the bottle down gently, aligning it with the edge of the table as if nothing had happened. The rhythm of service demanded composure, and composure was her disguise. But when she looked up again, Lucien's eyes met hers. For the first time that evening, she didn't look away. It wasn't defiance. It was acknowledgement. She knew. For a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face. Curiosity? Realization? He couldn't tell. His instinct said she couldn't possibly have understood. But there was something in her stillness that unsettled him. Evelyn noticed it too. Is something wrong? She asked softly. Lucien blinked once. No, he said. Nothing at all. But the room wasn't the same anymore. The temperature had shifted. The invisible hierarchy, the quiet power he wore like a tailored suit, had developed its first crack. Claire turned away, moving toward the service station. Each step was steady, deliberate, silent. But inside her chest, the translation repeated, looping through her thoughts like a lit fuse. Toujours la maladresse des petites gens. Always the clumsiness of small people. She wasn't angry, not yet. What she felt was colder, cleaner, clarity. The knowledge that she had just been dismissed not as an employee, but as a being of lesser worth. And that the man who'd done it considered himself a philosopher of truth. From across the room, Coleman tried to catch her eye, his expression panicked, mouthing silently, "Don't. React. Don't react." She didn't. Instead, she picked up another bottle, polished the neck with a linen napkin, and prepared to return to the table. Because if language was power, then tonight, power would change hands. The next sentence, she decided, would belong to her. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The air itself seemed to hesitate, unsure whether to breathe. Claire's hand lingered over the table, the faint scent of Bordeaux still clinging to her sleeve. Lucien's cuff, once pristine, now bore a small crimson bloom, drying into the silk like a signature he hadn't consented to. He leaned back slightly, fingers brushing the fabric, as if he could erase it through disdain alone. The wine, the insult, the laughter, they hung in the air, invisible but undeniable. Claire stood very still. The bottle in her hand trembled once, then stopped. Her face remained calm, but her eyes were alive with something unspoken. Every whisper from the kitchen faded. Every laugh from the other tables died away. Even the jazz pianist, sensing a shift in the room's pulse, let his hands hover above the keys, the final chord left unresolved. Lucien said nothing more. He didn't have to. The hierarchy of the world, as he understood it, had already been declared. He spoke, others absorbed. But this time, the world was about to speak back. Claire set the wine bottle down, slowly, deliberately. The glass touched the tablecloth with a soft sound, gentler than defiance, quieter than fear. Then she straightened her spine. Her voice, when it came, was soft but cutting, like silk drawn across steel. "Ce n'est pas la maladresse, monsieur," she said in perfect Parisian French. "It is not clumsiness, sir." The syllables glided through the air, clean, flawless, and unmistakable. Heads turned instantly. Evelyn's pen slipped from her fingers. Thomas's grin collapsed into silence. Claire's next words landed like glass on marble. "C'est la gravité de vos mots. It is gravity, the gravity of your words." The room froze. Lucien blinked once. For the first time in a very long time, someone had spoken to him, not as an equal in power, but as an equal in intellect, and not in English, in his language. A slow ripple of confusion passed through the restaurant. Guests leaned subtly toward the table, pretending not to listen, failing entirely. Evelyn recovered first. Her voice was barely audible. You speak French?" Claire didn't look at her. Her gaze was fixed on Lucien, calm and unwavering. Her tone softened, but only slightly. "Et d'ailleurs, monsieur," she continued, "votre phrase était grammaticalement incorrecte." "By the way, sir, your sentence was grammatically incorrect." The blood drained from Thomas Gray's face. He looked from Claire to Lucien, unsure which disaster was greater. Lucien didn't move. His expression remained unreadable. Only the smallest flicker in his eyes betrayed him. Shock, disbelief, a flash of recognition that something irreversible had just happened. Claire's voice did not rise. She didn't need it to. She spoke with the composure of a professor correcting a student in a quiet seminar. "You should have said," she went on, switching effortlessly between the two languages, "toujours la maladresse des petits gens, and please habitual error. But if you wish to sound eloquent, the construction should have been la maladresse des gens simples et rares, mais sincères." Her tone was precise, her diction crisp, each word slicing through the silence like a scalpel. She wasn't insulting him. She was teaching him. For a man like Lucien Dubreuil, that was infinitely worse. Across the table, Evelyn's hand rose halfway to her mouth, then lowered again. Thomas opened his lips as if to speak, but no words came. The power dynamic had flipped so violently that none of them could find footing. Lucien stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. His face was pale, drawn, the faint pulse of his jaw visible just beneath the skin. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than hers. "You correct me?" Claire's answer came without hesitation. "I correct the sentence, sir." The arrogance was already perfect. That one line, cool, unflinching, shattered whatever remained of the evening's composure. Somewhere near the bar, a spoon clattered to the floor. Coleman, frozen halfway to the table, stopped dead, his face an unreadable shade between fear and awe. The entire restaurant had gone silent now. Diners pretended to sip wine they no longer tasted. Every waiter stood still, waiting for the explosion that never came. Instead, Lucian simply exhaled, slowly, through his nose. He didn't look angry. He looked studious, as though her defiance were a new dialect he'd never heard before and needed to learn. Evelyn reached for his arm. "Sir." He lifted a hand to stop her. His eyes never left Claire. The two of them, teacher and test, mirror and reflection, stood locked in that moment, the world narrowing to the space between them. Claire's heartbeat thundered in her ears, but outwardly she remained still. She hadn't meant to humiliate him, not entirely. It had been instinct, reflex born from years of swallowing smaller insults until they filled her throat. Now, with the words out, she felt something strange. Not triumph, not fear, but release. Like exhaling after holding her breath for too long. Lucian spoke at last. "D'où venez-vous, mademoiselle?" "Where do you come from?" "From language," she replied. "And from people who taught me that it belongs to everyone." He held her gaze for another long moment. Then slowly, the faintest smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Not amusement, not approval, but recognition. Evelyn's whisper broke the spell. "Mr. Dubreuil, people are staring." He looked around the room as if noticing the audience for the first time. A dozen eyes darted away too late. The silence had thickened to the point of suffocation. Then Lucian chuckled softly. Once. A sound that felt both dangerous and oddly relieved. "Très bien," he murmured. "Very well." He dabbed at his cuff with the napkin, the crimson mark still visible like a tiny flag of defeat, or surrender. Then, looking back at Claire, he said quietly, "Touché." The single French word carried an entire confession. She had struck, and he had felt it. Claire inclined her head. In acknowledgement, a gesture so small it could have been mistaken for a bow. Then she gathered her tray, her movements controlled and deliberate. Behind her, the pianist began playing again, soft, cautious, as if afraid to disturb whatever force had just been unleashed. Mr. Coleman finally exhaled and stumbled backward, whispering to no one in particular. "What on earth just happened?" At the table, Evelyn leaned toward Lucian. "She humiliated you," she said under her breath. Lucian didn't answer right away. His eyes followed Claire as she walked away, the light glancing off her hair, her steps calm, unhurried. Finally, he said, "No, she educated me." Evelyn frowned. "And that doesn't bother you?" He smiled faintly, though his tone carried a trace of something unreadable. Respect, perhaps, or the first spark of interest. "It depends," he said, "on what I choose to learn next." From across the dining room, the reflection of Claire's retreating figure shimmered in a half-empty glass of wine. A single image suspended between defiance and destiny. The restaurant exhaled again, the spell broken. But everyone who had witnessed it would remember. The night a waitress corrected a billionaire, and for a breathless moment, the entire hierarchy of the world stopped moving. For a moment, no one at Le Verre d'Or remembered how to breathe. The clinking of cutlery, the soft music, even the hum of the city outside seemed to vanish, devoured by the silence that followed Claire's words. Lucien Dubreuil, who once lectured in Paris about the power of language as the architecture of civilization, now sat perfectly still, undone by it, not by volume, not by force, but by precision. The scholar who had built an empire on rhetoric found himself, for the first time in decades, on the wrong side of a sentence. He didn't look angry, he looked fascinated. The corners of his mouth tightened slightly, not in disapproval, but in realization. Somewhere deep behind those gray eyes, the gears of curiosity began to turn again, slowly, deliberately, like an old machine remembering its purpose. Evelyn's heart shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Thomas Gray stared at the tablecloth, as if the patterns might offer an escape. Finally, Lucian exhaled, his voice steady, almost amused. "Extraordinary," he murmured, half to himself. "A woman who wields grammar as a blade." Claire said nothing. Her pulse thundered, but she refused to let it reach her face. She simply bowed her head slightly as if to say, "It was only the truth, sir." Lucian leaned back, still studying her like a puzzle that refused to solve itself. Then, in a tone that blended approval and authority, he spoke softly in French. "Laissez-la tranquille." Evelyn blinked. "Sir?" He turned his gaze toward the approaching storm. Mr. Coleman, marching through the dining room with the fury of a man certain that an employee had just destroyed his career. Coleman's face was flushed crimson, his tie askew, panic in every line of his body. "Claire!" he hissed, barely keeping his voice down. "What on earth do you think you're—" "Enough," Lucian said sharply, switching back to English. The single word cut through the space like the crack of a whip. Coleman froze mid-step. Lucian's gaze hardened. "You will leave her alone." Coleman stammered. Mr. Dubroy, I assure you, she's not authorized to—" "I do not need your assurances," Lucian interrupted, his tone flat, absolute. "Je ne répète pas. I do not repeat myself." The color drained from Coleman's face. He nodded, took one step back, and nearly tripped over his own polished shoes before retreating toward the bar, muttering apologies to no one in particular. The rest of the restaurant followed his retreat with silent eyes. A waitress commanding a billionaire's respect? It was a scene that didn't fit into any version of the world they knew. Lucian waited until Coleman was gone, then turned back to Claire. "Sit," he said quietly, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. At first, she thought she'd misheard. The offer, or rather, the command, didn't belong in a restaurant. It belonged in some other world, one where hierarchy could bend for curiosity. "Sir, I'm still on duty," she said carefully. Lucian's lips curved in that faint, infuriatingly calm half-smile. "For whom?" The question landed heavier than intended. He wasn't asking about the restaurant. He was asking about everything, her role, her place, her limits. Evelyn frowned. "Mr. Dubroy," he lifted a hand. "It's all right, Evelyn, I insist." Thomas cleared his throat, still awkward. "Perhaps this isn't—" Lucian silenced him with a glance. "Thomas, you once told me the key to leadership is recognizing potential before it announces itself. Consider this a demonstration." Thomas sank back in his chair, wisely saying nothing more. All eyes returned to Claire. The weight of every gaze pressed down on her shoulders, her managers from afar, the diners, even the silent awe of the other waiters who had stopped mid-step. Her instincts screamed no. Every rule of professionalism forbade it. But something stronger pushed back, a quiet voice that whispered, "You've already crossed the line, might as well stand on it." Claire inhaled deeply. Then, with quiet grace, she pulled out the chair and sat down. The world seemed to tilt. You could feel the shock ripple through the room like the aftermath of thunder. A waitress had just taken a seat across from Lucien Dubroy, the man whose signature could shift economies. The candle between them flickered once, throwing their faces into alternating shadows of defiance and intrigue. Lucian leaned forward slightly. "Comfortable?" he asked, as if testing her resolve. "I prefer standing," she replied. He smiled faintly. "And yet, here you are." Claire's eyes met his, unwavering. "Because you asked, not because I needed to." Thomas's mouth fell open slightly. Evelyn looked away, hiding a smirk that was part disbelief, part admiration. Lucian let out a low chuckle, the sound like velvet over glass. "Confidence is a dangerous luxury, Mademoiselle Moreau." "Then I suppose I'm already in debt," she said calmly. For a long moment, neither spoke. It was the kind of silence that stretched, not in discomfort, but in mutual study. A battle of intellects fought entirely through restraint. Lucian broke it first. "You corrected me," he said quietly. "Flawlessly. You knew exactly what you were doing." Claire's answer came like a steady heartbeat. "Only because I understood what you were saying." He tilted his head, genuinely curious now. "And what was I saying?" "That words can separate those who command from those who serve." Her voice softened. "But you forgot. They can also unite them." Evelyn's eyes flicked up, watching Lucian's expression shift again, less like a man defending his ego, more like one remembering an idea he'd lost long ago. He nodded slowly, as if conceding a minor point in a larger war. "Perhaps. Or perhaps," she said, "you just never met someone willing to reply." That made him laugh, a real quiet laugh that startled everyone at the table, even himself. The sound was low, rich, dangerous. Thomas exhaled in relief, pouring himself another drink. Evelyn rolled her eyes subtly, but there was an edge of amusement there too. Lucian's gaze lingered on Claire a moment longer. thoughtful now. Then he reached for his glass, raised it slightly toward her, and said in French, "À ceux qui répondent," to those who reply. Claire hesitated, then mirrored the gesture. "Et à ceux qui écoutent," and to those who listen. Their glasses touched with a delicate chime. It wasn't a toast between equals, but it wasn't obedience either. It was something in between, something far rarer. Acknowledgement. The murmur of conversation in the restaurant began to return, cautious at first, as if everyone needed permission to speak again. At the bar, Coleman downed a shot of espresso and muttered, "She's finished. Absolutely finished." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure who he was trying to convince. At table 7, Lucian leaned back, regarding Claire with quiet amusement. "You've made this evening unexpectedly educational," he said. She stood slowly, smoothing her apron. "Then, perhaps my work here is done." He nodded once, eyes gleaming. "Perhaps it's only beginning." And as she walked away, the faintest smile lingered on his lips, the look of a man who just discovered something rare. Not submission, not defiance, something infinitely more dangerous. Interest. The tension that had gripped the restaurant still lingered in the air, thin, fragile, alive. But at table 7, something else had begun to take shape. Not confrontation now, but curiosity. The air between them glowed softly in the candlelight. Lucien Dubreuil sat with his elbows lightly resting on the table, fingertips pressed together in thought. He looked at Claire not as a server anymore, but as a question he hadn't yet solved. "Tell me," he said finally, his voice calm but edged with quiet demand. "Who taught you to speak like that?" Claire tilted her head slightly, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "No one taught me," she said. "I learned it the same way I learned everything else, by reading and by listening." Her tone was steady, factual, almost serene. "Books taught me structure, listening taught me meaning." She paused, then added, "The same way, I suppose, you learned power." For a brief instant there was silence. Then Lucian's mouth curved, just barely. He didn't take offense. He was intrigued. "You believe I learned power?" he asked. "You think it can be taught?" Claire smiled faintly. "You taught it yourself, didn't you?" That made him blink. "Pardon?" "In your book," she said, "Language and Power, Chapter 3. You called power a learned dialect, a language only those willing to listen can ever speak fluently." His brow furrowed slightly. "You've read it." "I studied it," she corrected gently, "and argued with it." Now Evelyn, who had been sitting stiffly beside him, looked up from her notes. "You've read Mr. Dubreuil's work?" she asked, incredulous. "That's not light reading." Claire's answer was simple. "Neither is working 2 jobs and finishing a thesis." Thomas chuckled uneasily. "You're quite the scholar, then." Claire's gaze never left Lucian. "Just curious." Lucian leaned forward, the candlelight throwing sharp lines across his face. "Curiosity," he said, "is the beginning of ambition." "And arrogance," she replied softly, "is often its end." Evelyn's eyes widened. Thomas froze mid-sip. But Lucian only smiled, genuinely this time. "You're bold," he said, "dangerously so. Only when truth is worth the risk." He studied her quietly for a moment longer, his expression unreadable. Then he asked, his voice lower now, "You seem to know a great deal about me, Mademoiselle Moreau. Should I be concerned?" "Only if you believe truth is dangerous," she said. He chuckled, a low sound that felt foreign coming from him. "And what truth have you discovered about me?" Claire hesitated, not out of fear, but consideration. She measured her words the way he measured investments, precisely, deliberately. "I know," she said finally, "that the man who once lectured on the philosophy of dignity shouldn't humiliate those who serve." The words landed softly, but they hit with a weight of stone. Lucian's smile faded, not out of offense, but reflection. He hadn't expected her to say it aloud. Most people didn't speak to him like that, certainly not in public, and never with such calm. Across the table, Evelyn straightened in her chair. "Careful," she murmured, but Lucian lifted a hand, stopping her. "No, let her speak." He turned his full attention to Claire, his eyes narrowing slightly, studying every line of her face as if searching for the mechanism of her courage. For the first time, his voice softened. "You've read my lectures." "I've memorized parts of them," she said quietly. Not because I admired them, but because they reminded me that words only matter when the person speaking still believes them. He looked almost amused, though his eyes betrayed something deeper, an old ache perhaps, or a long-forgotten sense of shame. "You assume I've stopped believing," he said. She met his gaze. "I assume you forgot what belief sounded like." The candle flickered between them, a single flame caught in the current of their exchange. Thomas shifted uncomfortably, whispering to Evelyn, "This is getting philosophical." Evelyn whispered back, "It's getting dangerous." Lucian ignored them both. His attention was entirely on the young woman across the table, the waitress who quoted Pascal and corrected his French without trembling. He raised his glass, studying the crimson swirl within. "You think dignity still exists in a world like this?" he asked. "In boardrooms, in banks, in empires?" "Dignity doesn't vanish," Claire said. "People just stop looking for it." Her voice was calm, but it carried a quiet force. She wasn't lecturing him, she was reminding him. Lucian's eyes softened for the briefest second. "You speak like someone older than you are." "I listen to people who never were," she replied. He laughed again, louder this time, a dry, surprised laugh that turned a few heads nearby. "Evelyn," he said, turning to his assistant. "Do you hear this? She compares my cynicism to inexperience." Evelyn gave a thin smile. Perhaps she's not entirely wrong. Lucian's gaze snapped back to Claire. "You know," he said, "you're the first person in 10 years to speak to me without calculation." Claire's answer came instantly. "Maybe I'm just bad at math." Another ripple of laughter escaped him, genuine, unguarded. The diners nearby relaxed slightly, not understanding why they felt relieved, only sensing the shift. The storm had passed, for now. He leaned forward again, elbows on the table, his tone quieter. "You've intrigued me, Mademoiselle Moreau. That doesn't happen often." "I wasn't trying to," she said. "Exactly," he replied. "That's why it worked." For a long moment, the world seemed smaller, just the two of them and the flame between. Evelyn cleared her throat, trying to restore formality. "Mr. Dubreuil, perhaps we should—" But Lucian silenced her with a subtle gesture. Later, he turned back to Claire. "You said words belong to everyone. Do you really believe that?" "I do," she said. "Language isn't born from the powerful. It's borrowed from the living. Everyone who speaks adds something to it." "Then, what did you add tonight?" he asked softly. Claire looked at him steadily. "Remembrance." He raised a brow. "Of what?" "That once, your words inspired people instead of hurting them." For the first time since she'd met him, Lucian had no immediate reply. He stared at her, silent, contemplative. Then, slowly, a small, genuine smile appeared, the kind that didn't reach his lips so much as escape from somewhere far behind them. "Well played," he said finally. Claire tilted her head. "It's not a game, Mr. Dubreuil." "Everything is," he said. "Business, politics, even conversation. But tonight," he hesitated. "Tonight, I may have met someone who knows how to play differently." She gave the smallest of smiles. "Maybe it's time the rules changed." He laughed under his breath. "Perhaps." The candle between them flickered again, a small golden heartbeat. For the first time that evening, there was no tension in the air, only an unexpected quiet, the kind that follows mutual understanding. At the bar, Coleman stared in disbelief as the billionaire and the waitress sat facing each other like two philosophers in a salon. He whispered to another waiter, "What in God's name is happening?" But the waiter only shrugged. "I think she's winning." By the time dessert arrived, the snow outside had thickened into silence. The city beyond Le Verre d'Or blurred behind frost and glass, while inside, the last candle at table 7 burned lower, its flame bending toward exhaustion. Lucien Dubreuil had stopped talking business long ago. Evelyn and Thomas had drifted into uneasy quiet, exchanging looks that asked the same question. What exactly was happening here? Claire stood by the table, holding the tray against her hip. The rhythm of service had long since dissolved. The air was heavier now, slower, charged with something that didn't belong in a restaurant. Lucian's gaze lingered on her one last time before he broke the silence. "You know," he said, his voice softer now, "most people speak to impress. You speak to understand." Claire didn't answer. The compliment, if it was one, sounded more like an observation, as if he were studying her through a microscope. He leaned back, finishing his wine. That is rare. Evelyn cleared her throat, snapping the moment back into formality. Sir, your car will be here in 5 minutes. Lucien nodded absently, then turned to Claire. Tell me, Mademoiselle Moreau, have you ever considered working somewhere other than this? She smiled politely. Every night. I don't mean a different restaurant, he said. I mean a different world. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. Sir, Lucien ignored him. He reached into his jacket and placed a black business card on the white tablecloth. The gold letters glinted under the candlelight. Lucien Dubreuil, President, Dubreuil Capital Group. I need someone who understands more than language, he said. Someone who can translate the psychology behind it. Claire frowned slightly. I'm not sure I follow. Lucien gestured with the faintest motion of his hand, as if sketching the outline of an idea. In my company, he said, we're merging with an American investment firm. 2 cultures colliding, 2 vocabularies of power. My people speak French precision, theirs American persuasion. We misunderstand each other even when we use the same words. He paused, studying her face. You, mademoiselle, speak both. Claire blinked. You're offering me a job? Evelyn's expression tightened. Mr. Dubreuil, that's highly unorthodox. Unorthodox, he repeated, amused. So is intelligence in unexpected places. Thomas laughed weakly. She's a waitress, sir, not a consultant. Lucien's gaze shifted to him, icy and immediate. She is whatever her mind allows her to be. The statement silenced them all. Claire stared at the card, the letters shimmering faintly in the candlelight. What kind of job? She asked finally, her voice careful. Lucien leaned forward. A cultural liaison and communication consultant, he said. You would work directly with my executive team, translating nuance, mediating intent, decoding what people mean when they say one thing and want another. Her brows furrowed. That sounds more like diplomacy than business. Precisely, he said, and I prefer diplomats who haven't been trained to lie. She blinked, caught between disbelief and awe. You're serious? Lucien nodded once. Completely. And the salary? She asked, partly as a test, partly because she couldn't imagine where this conversation could still be real. Evelyn answered before he could. $180,000 a year, plus relocation if needed. The tray in Claire's hands nearly slipped. She steadied it quickly, hiding the shock that rippled through her. That's absurd. Lucien smiled faintly. So is potential, until someone recognizes it. The words hung there, luminous and dangerous. Thomas coughed softly. Mr. Dubreuil, this isn't protocol. You can't just... Lucien cut him off with a calm glance. Protocol is what happens when imagination dies. Then, turning back to Claire, he said, I'm not asking for an answer now. Only that you consider it. She hesitated. Every instinct screamed, this isn't real, yet every detail was too deliberate to be fantasy. The card, the tone, the timing, it all fit the pattern of a man who made offers that changed lives, and collected the debts later. Claire's voice was barely above a whisper. Why me? He didn't hesitate. Because you're not afraid of me. The words struck harder than she expected. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. Lucien continued, almost reflective. Everyone in my company fears me. They agree too quickly. They praise what they don't understand. You, mademoiselle, told me the truth, even when it risked your job. He leaned back. That is rare and valuable. She swallowed. Valuable enough to buy? His smile deepened, slow and knowing. I don't buy people. I invest in them. That's the same thing, she said quietly. No, he replied, his tone softening. An investment grows. A purchase ends. For the first time, Claire looked directly at him, not as a server, but as a woman standing at the crossroads of two worlds. And if I say no, he didn't blink. Then I'll admire your conviction and offer again tomorrow. She almost laughed, but her voice came out steadier than she felt. You don't give up easily. I don't have to, he said. People give up on themselves first. She studied the card again, its weight far greater than the paper it was printed on. "This is generous," she said, "but I can't accept." "Can't," he echoed, raising a brow. "Or won't." "Won't," she said simply. "Because I'm not for sale." Lucian regarded her for a long, unreadable moment. Then, slowly, he smiled. Not the cold smirk of superiority she'd seen before, but something gentler, almost approving. "Bon," he murmured. "Good." Evelyn frowned. "Sir?" He stood, adjusting his cuff as if the red stain were no longer worth noticing. "I prefer people who can't be bought." Claire exhaled softly, unsure whether she had just passed a test or failed one she didn't know she was taking. Lucian slipped the business card toward her. "Keep it anyway," he said. "Respect must be practiced, not preached. Consider this practice." He glanced toward the door where his driver was waiting. "Evelyn." "Yes, sir." She rose immediately, gathering the folio. Thomas followed, fumbling for his coat, still glancing back at Claire like a man who'd just witnessed a magic trick he couldn't explain. Lucian paused before leaving, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "In another life," he said softly, "perhaps we would have spoken sooner." Then he turned and walked away. The golden door closed behind him with a soft, deliberate click. For a long time, Claire stood motionless. The restaurant was quiet again, but something in its balance had shifted forever. On the table before her, the business card gleamed under the dying candlelight. Lucien Dubreuil, Président. She stared at it for a long moment, her reflection flickering across the gold letters. It felt like both a key and a warning. Outside, snow whispered against the glass. Inside, her breath fogged the air like a promise she wasn't sure she wanted to keep. The city was half buried in snow by the time Claire reached home. Boston's skyline glowed through the storm, its lights blurred into watercolor streaks across her window. Her room, barely wider than a train compartment, was warm only where the small desk lamp reached. It was the kind of space that held everything she owned and nothing she truly wanted. Books lined every wall, stacked 2, 3 layers deep. French poetry beside economics. Philosophy beside linguistics. The scent of paper and cold air filled the room. On the shelf above her bed sat a faded photograph. A woman in her 40s, standing in a vineyard near Lyon, laughing into the wind, her mother. Claire brushed the dust from the corner of the frame and whispered softly, "Bonsoir, maman." The word maman cracked something in her chest. It had been 2 years since she last saw her. The pandemic, the distance, the endless work shifts had built a wall she couldn't cross. But her mother's voice still echoed in her memory like a melody she could never forget. "Dignité, ma fille. Dignity, my daughter. You can lose everything else, but never that." Claire sat at her small wooden desk, the hum of the radiator her only companion. On the surface, among stacks of books, lay the black and gold card, Lucien Dubreuil, Président. The letters gleamed under the desk lamp, sharp and deliberate, like they had been printed to seduce ambition. She stared at it for a long time, trying to decide what emotion it stirred, pride, disbelief, or fear. Maybe all three. Her phone buzzed, a message from Rosa. "Rosa. Girl, you okay?" "Rosa. Coleman's losing it. He's been telling people you flirted your way into some kind of offer." "Rosa. Said you embarrassed the restaurant. He wants to talk to you tomorrow." Claire stared at the screen, her stomach sinking. She could picture it already. Coleman pacing the office, veins tight with rage, trying to reclaim control of a story that had escaped him. In his world, any woman who spoke too well must have used something other than words. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard. She typed, then deleted, then typed again. "Claire, let him talk. Claire, the truth has a longer memory than gossip." She pressed send, then placed the phone face down beside the business card. The room fell silent again, but her mind didn't. It replayed the evening in fragments, the red drop of wine on Lucian's cuff, his cold gaze melting into curiosity, the way his tone had softened when he said, "Because you're not afraid of me." Not afraid? She had been terrified, but fear, she had learned, wasn't the same as surrender. Claire leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes. For a moment, she let herself imagine what life could look like if she said yes. A real salary. A real future. Her mother finally able to stop working late shifts at the Lyon library. She could almost hear her voice again. Warm, teasing, proud. Ma petite fille, you've done it. You've crossed the sea. But another memory rose too, one she tried not to revisit. The night her mother was fired from that same library after standing up to a patron who insulted a junior staff member. The woman who had taught her the word dignité had paid the price for it. And now, here Claire was, offered the world by a man who had insulted her in the same tone her mother once fought against. Her chest tightened. She picked up the card again, turning it over. The back was blank, clean, heavy, unforgiving. "You're not for sale," she whispered to herself. But even as she said it, the weight of those numbers echoed in her head. 180,000. Freedom, disguised as a contract. Her phone buzzed again. Rosa. "Don't go in early tomorrow. He's serious. He wants to call HR. "Rosa? You don't deserve this, Claire." Claire smiled faintly at the screen, her eyes tired. "Claire. It's fine. Some people mistake integrity for rebellion." She put the phone away and rested her elbows on the desk, her fingers threading through her hair. The walls of the room seemed to close in a little. The wind outside howled through the narrow alley, rattling the window pane. Her reflection in the glass stared back, half light, half shadow. A young woman with too much education for her paycheck and too much conscience for her comfort. "Who are you, really?" she whispered to her reflection. The reflection didn't answer. Only the city lights flickered back at her, like Morse code from another life. She stood, pacing the small room, the floor creaking beneath her steps. Her gaze drifted again to the photograph of her mother. That vineyard smile, those steady eyes that had never learned to bow. Claire picked up the photo frame, holding it close. "What would you do?" she whispered. But she already knew the answer. Her mother had lived her whole life with dignity and died with almost nothing. Would she want her daughter to suffer the same way, or to break the pattern, even if it meant walking through fire? The question tore at her like a quiet war. She sat back down, this time slower, her hands resting on either side of the business card. It looked different now, not like an invitation, but like a mirror. Every reflection came with a cost, every opportunity with a shadow. She opened one of her books, a collection of Pascal essays, and found the line she had underlined years ago. All of man's misfortune comes from one thing, not knowing how to stay quietly in a room. She smiled bitterly. If only it were that easy. Outside, the storm thickened, snow piling up like unwritten pages against her window. She turned off her lamp and sat in darkness, the city's light still bleeding faintly into her room. The glow caught the gold edges of Lucien's card on the desk, the letters LD glimmering like a door half open. Claire whispered to the darkness, half prayer, half confession. "If I take this, who will I become?" There was no answer. Only the steady hum of the radiator and the whisper of snow. She closed her eyes, the image of Lucien's gaze still haunting her. Sharp, curious, almost respectful. "Respect must be practiced," he had said. Maybe he was right. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe the only way to find out was to see what he practiced next. Her phone buzzed once more before she drifted towards sleep. A new message, unknown number, unknown. 9 a.m. tomorrow, Dubreuil Capital. The door is open. Claire stared at it for a long time, her pulse quickening. Then she turned the phone face down, placed it beside the business card, and whispered to the room, "Not yet." The light from the street lamp outside flickered once and faded. The last thing she saw before closing her eyes was the card, still there, still waiting, like a key to both freedom and danger. The city looked different from 60 stories up. From that height, Boston seemed weightless, like a model made of glass and fog, detached from the noise that sustained it. Inside the marble corridors of Dubreuil Capital, silence wasn't absence. It was strategy. Claire stepped through the revolving doors at exactly 8:57 a.m., her coat still damp from the melting snow, her fingers trembling just slightly around the strap of her worn leather bag. The lobby was a cathedral of power, polished stone floors, dark wood walls, and silver fixtures that reflected every insecurity she tried to hide. A receptionist in black greeted her with a professional nod. "Mademoiselle Moreau, they're expecting you. Please, the express elevator to 60. The ride up was fast, unnervingly smooth. Her reflection in the mirrored walls looked like someone else. Hair pulled back neatly, eyes focused, wearing the only blazer she owned. When the doors slid open, she stepped into a world built entirely for control. The Dubreuil Capital executive floor was minimalist, silent, almost surgical. Glass panels framed the skyline. The air smelled faintly of steel and coffee. No chatter, no clutter, only precision. Evelyn Hart was waiting by the reception desk, tablet in hand, smile calculated to the millimeter. "Good morning, Miss Moreau," she said. The tone was polite, but the eyes, sharp, measuring. "Good morning," Claire replied. Evelyn looked her up and down, assessing every detail like a border officer inspecting a passport. "This way, please." They walked through a corridor lined with black and white photographs of bridges and cathedrals, symbols of architecture and endurance. The unspoken message was clear. Dubreuil built things that lasted. Evelyn's heels clicked like a metronome on the polished floor. Without turning, she said, "You've caused quite a conversation, you know." Claire kept her tone neutral. "I tend to do that when people underestimate me." A small flicker crossed Evelyn's face. Annoyance or admiration, Claire couldn't tell. "He's not used to being challenged," Evelyn said. "So if you're here to challenge him again—" "I'm here to talk," Claire interrupted softly. They reached a vast waiting room. Floor-to-ceiling glass offered a dizzying view of the harbor, sunlight scattering across the water like spilled silver. The chairs were leather, the coffee table glass, the atmosphere arctic. Evelyn gestured for her to sit. "He'll be with you shortly." Claire nodded, placing her bag beside the chair. Her heart pounded, but her breathing was steady. She had rehearsed this conversation all night, every sentence, every possible reaction. Now, the silence was her only opponent. Minutes passed. Then, the faint sound of footsteps approached. Lucien Dubreuil entered, not in a suit, but in a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. No tie, no jacket. Even his arrival was an act of theater, a deliberate signal. "I'm not here as the chairman. I'm here as the decision maker." "Good morning," he said, voice calm, almost casual. Claire stood. "Good morning, Mr. Dubreuil." He smiled faintly. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't come." "I almost didn't," she said. "That would have been a tragedy," he replied, walking to the window. "Few people decline my offers twice. It creates a myth I can't control." Claire didn't smile. "Maybe that's a good thing." Lucien turned to her. The sunlight cut across his profile, casting half his face in gold, the other in shadow. "Let's find out," he said, gesturing toward the low table near the window. "Please, sit." She did. He took the seat opposite her. For a moment, neither spoke. The city stretched below them, a living map of everything he owned and everything she didn't. Finally, Lucien broke the silence. "Before we begin, I should warn you, I'm not easily impressed twice." Claire met his eyes. "Then I'll save us both time. I didn't come here to impress you." One of his eyebrows lifted slightly. No, she said. "I came here to set conditions." He leaned back, intrigued. "Conditions?" "Yes," she said. "If I'm to work for you, there are 3. Lucien smiled faintly, folding his hands. "Go on." Her voice was calm but firm, each word deliberate. "First, respect. Not as a courtesy, but as policy. No condescension, no mockery, no matter the setting or the language." He said nothing, only nodded once. "Second, autonomy. I'm finishing my degree. I will not give up my education to build your empire. My hours must allow for my studies. And when the two conflict, my education wins." Lucien tilted his head slightly. "That may conflict with corporate deadlines." "Then you'll have to learn flexibility," she said. That earned her a quiet chuckle. "You do realize who you're speaking to?" "Yes," she said. "And so do you." He studied her a moment longer. "And the third?" Claire took a slow breath. "The signing bonus. You offered one last night." He nodded. $100,000. "I don't want it," she said. His brows lifted slightly. "You refuse money?" "I want it redirected." "Redirected where?" "To a scholarship fund," she said. For students of linguistics and cross-cultural studies at Harvard and Lyon, it will be called the Dubreuil Dignité Fund. Her voice didn't waver on the last word. The air between them seemed to still again, heavier this time, charged with meaning. Lucien sat back slowly, his expression unreadable. Evelyn, who had been pretending to type something nearby, looked up, startled. Dignité? Lucien repeated softly. Of all words, why that one? Claire met his eyes. Because you reminded me what happens when people forget it. Silence stretched. For a long time, he said nothing. The light from the window caught the edge of his desk, cutting across the room in a thin line that reached her hands. The air conditioner hummed faintly. Finally, Lucien spoke. You're aware, of course, that most people in your position would simply accept the terms. I'm not most people, she said quietly. He smiled again, slowly this time, like someone conceding a long game of chess. No, he said. You're not. He stood, moving toward the window, hands in his pockets. The sunlight. Manda struck his shirt, turning the white fabric translucent. You remind me of something I used to believe, he said, that words can civilize power. Maybe they still can, Claire said softly. He turned, meeting her gaze. For the first time, there was warmth in it. Vous êtes dangereuse, he murmured. You're more dangerous than I thought. Claire rose to her feet. Danger isn't the goal, Mr. Dubreuil. Integrity is. He studied her a moment longer, then extended his hand. Then, let's see if the two can coexist. She hesitated only a second before shaking it. His grip was firm, steady, equal. Bienvenue, he said. Welcome to Dubreuil Capital. Outside, the wind howled faintly against the glass, carrying the sound of the city below. Inside, two figures stood by the window, one forged in privilege, one in perseverance. And for a brief, impossible instant, the balance of power looked perfectly even. The elevator doors closed behind her with a soft sigh, that delicate sound of endings disguised as silence. Claire stepped out into the morning light. Boston had shed its storm overnight, and the city seemed to shimmer with a kind of quiet clarity. Snowmelt gleamed along the streets, catching the sunlight like liquid glass. She pulled her scarf tighter around her neck and exhaled, her breath turning into mist that dissolved above the pavement. The towering glass facade of Dubreuil Capital rose behind her, its windows catching the morning sun, cold, magnificent, alive. For a moment, she just stood there, watching her own reflection in those endless panes of glass, a small figure among giants. And yet, for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel small. A gust of wind swept through the plaza, sharp and playful. It caught the edge of her handkerchief, the one her mother had embroidered years ago, the one she always kept tucked into her sleeve. The tiny C stitched in gold thread fluttered into the air like a piece of her past breaking free. She laughed softly, chasing it a few steps, before it landed against the marble edge of the fountain. When she picked it up, her reflection rippled across the water, half in sunlight, half in shadow. Claire looked at the letter on the fabric, tracing it with her thumb. C for courage, she whispered. Then, with a smile that wasn't quite joy but something steadier, acceptance, she tucked it safely into her pocket. The city moved around her, impatient, indifferent, eternal. Taxi horns echoed, steam rose from vents, and business people hurried past her without a glance. But Claire wasn't hurrying anymore. She was walking forward at her own pace, through a world that finally felt wide enough to hold her. Her thoughts drifted back to the 60th floor, the way Lucien had paused when she said dignité, the faint curve of his smile, not of victory, but of rediscovery. He had met a mirror in a place he thought he owned, and she had learned that even mirrors can speak. A voice, soft, female, ageless, seemed to echo from somewhere far away. Her mother's voice. Dignité, ma fille. Claire closed her eyes for a moment, breathing it in, letting the words settle not as memory, but as promise. Up above, on the 60th floor, Lucien stood by the window, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the street below. The office was quiet now, the meeting room cleared, the air still carrying the faint trace of her perfume, jasmine and rain. Evelyn entered quietly, holding a folder. The contract's ready for signature. Lucian didn't turn. His gaze followed the small figure crossing the street below, her steps light, unhurried. "She'll say yes," Evelyn said matter-of-factly. Lucian's lips curved slightly. "She already did," he murmured. Evelyn frowned. "I don't understand." "She didn't come for the money," he said softly, "or the title. She came for something no one can buy." He touched the glass with his fingertips, the city gleaming beneath. A single word escaped him, half whisper, half confession. Dignité. Across town, in a small cafe overlooking the river, Claire found a corner table by the window. The place smelled of espresso and croissants, of warmth and ordinary life. She opened her laptop, the familiar hum of it grounding her. For a few seconds, she stared at the blank document on the screen. Then she began to type, slowly at first, then faster. The first line appeared in clean black letters. Projet Dubreuil, Études sur la communication interculturelle. Dubreuil Project, Study on Intercultural Communication. She paused, her reflection faint on the laptop screen, mingled with the soft light spilling through the window. Then she added a subtitle, each word deliberate. Dignité as a bridge between language and power. Her fingers hovered for a moment. Then she typed her name at the bottom. Claire Moreau, cultural consultant. The words looked unreal, like they belonged to someone else, but she smiled because they were hers. She leaned back, letting the morning sun spill across her face. Outside, the snow had melted into streams that carried the city's reflection along their surfaces, rivers of glass and possibility. For the first time, Claire didn't feel like she was translating the world. She felt like she was finally speaking it. Narrator, voiceover. Sometimes strength doesn't come from power, not from money or rank or names on glass doors. It comes from words spoken when no one expects you to speak at all, from the courage to stand still in a room built to make you small, from the decision to answer arrogance with grace and ignorance with precision. It comes from the quiet conviction that dignity is not given. It is practiced. It is lived. A soft chime sounded from Claire's laptop. An email. The subject line read, Bienvenue à Dubreuil Capital. Her heart beat once, hard before settling. She opened it. The message was short. Mademoiselle Moreau, welcome to the team. I expect your first report by Friday. LD? She smiled, shaking her head. Of course, she whispered. Then she added a single reply beneath his message. Dignité toujours. Dignity always. She pressed send. Outside, the city brightened as the sun climbed higher, the glass towers catching fire in the light. And for the first time, the name Dubreuil didn't sound like an empire to her. It sounded like a beginning. That evening, as the camera pulls away through the cafe window, the screen of her laptop glows faintly. The last line of her draft remains visible. Dignité. The word lingers, pulsing like a heartbeat against the white page. A promise, a lesson, a bridge.